Denisovans, mystery Homo species that conquered the world? Well, almost. Denisovan is the term for a group of hominins that thrived in the middle of the Pleistocene and covered some of the most populated areas in modern history. From frozen mountains to tropical islands, blizzards to beaches, this group lived throughout Eurasia, Australia, and many Pacific islands. Using mitochondrial DNA, scientists can track past migrations of Denisovans and even tell us where their legacy lives on. You see, same as with Neanderthals, Denisovan DNA lives on in certain populations. But Denisovans haven't really been well defined yet. Despite DNA profiles, several fragments of bones, and one debatable, wonderfully intact skull, the group referred to as Denisovans isn't officially classified as a species of Homo, or even a subspecies. They are, for lack of a better word, a mystery. Enjoy looking back at ancient history and the past? Like and subscribe to A Day in History to learn more. Next best thing to a time machine. It's important to note that, like a lot of research into humanity's ancient family tree, there are many theories and opinions on the Denisovans. While most scientists involved seem to agree that Denisovans represent a distinctly different group of Homo, there isn't any real consensus on where exactly they fall in the taxonomy. The Denisovans were originally discovered in Denisova's cave in the Altai Mountains in Siberia, literally translated to Denis's cave in the Bare Rock Mountains. Not scientifically important, but very Tolkien. Various remains from various times, stretching from 300,000 to 50,000 years ago, indicate Denisovans inhabited this cave for a long, long time. They shared, displaced, or were displaced from this cave with Neanderthals as well, as some Neanderthal remains were discovered. One of the discoveries was a hybrid Neanderthal Denisovan named Deni, because scientists recognize a square peg for a square hole as far as naming conventions go. Using mitochondrial DNA, the Denisovan genome was determined to become distinct around 1 million years ago. It's debated whether this split was an archaic pseudo-Denisovan Neanderthal that then went on to become two separate groups, or if Denisovans were a completely different exodus from Africa, which was later followed by other versions of Homo, or possibly neither theory. This particular subject is rife with controversy, and it is unlikely a prevailing hypothesis will dominate with the information we currently have. Denisovans were larger than most other examples of our lineage, similar in size to Neanderthals. Their brains were also among the largest of the archaic Homo line, again matched only by Neanderthals and modern humans. One big brainy family. Denisovans were likely dark-skinned, with hair and eyes to match, with a flatter face and more prominent eyebrow ridge. Like the other archaic Homo groups, scientists think their jaws lacked the projection of bone known as the mental protuberance or chin. Similar to Neanderthals in build and stature, they used hand tools made of stone or bone. There was jewelry among the remains at Denisova, but it was found in layers dated to overlap with the arrival of modern humans, so it is unknown whether Denisovans created or wore decorative pieces. They would have likely shared many of the facets of life of their Neanderthal neighbors and eventually modern humans. Hunting game, which was processed for food and useful materials, they would have gathered what other sustenance they could have from the surrounding area. Knowing there were other groups of humans present and the typical behavior of, well, us, there was sure to have been fighting over resources and something approaching diplomacy. We know interactions happened regularly as Neanderthal, Denisovan, and modern human DNA show extensive and repeated signs of interbreeding. Can't deny contact with the group if you've got their genes. In China, Harbin City, there is a harrowing tale of a Chinese man saving a remarkably intact ancient skull from invaders and secreting it away until he revealed its location on his deathbed more than half a century later. This skull, named the Harbin skull after the city it was found in, became the basis for a theory on a whole new species of archaic human, known as Homo longi, named for the province of Heilongjiang. The area is commonly referred to as Longjiang and roughly translates as Dragon River. This proposed species owes its discovery to a story of courage and perseverance. The Hominins skull shows a brain size of around 1,400 milliliters, placing it right in the range of Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and topically Denisovans. The skull is missing the lower jaw, but retains one tooth that is relatively huge for its era. Longer and skinnier than a modern human skull, the Hominins skull shows a closer similarity to the Homo sapiens than most of the other hominid skulls, debatably even Neanderthal. Huge eye sockets and large protruding eyebrow ridges give the dragon man an appearance of what you might picture as an ancient caveman. Unfortunately, the tale is essentially unconfirmable, the skull itself, having been moved from its previous resting place to keep it safe during its rescue, is not as informative as if it had been found in the original location. Despite this, scientists studying the Hominins skull believe it represents a new species. Other scientists think this is the first intact skull of a southern arm of the Denisovan family, proof that their projected dispersal reached far and wide. The only other documented remains of Denisovans outside the titular cave were found in northern China, on the Tibetan plateau. The jury is still out on the fate of Dragon Man, whether he is his own special species or another example of Denisovan expansion throughout Asia. If the Hominins skull does belong to a Denisovan, then it's the largest and most intact piece thereof. Using previously mentioned mitochondrial DNA, science has tracked Denisovan DNA from Africa throughout the world. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to offspring and mutates or changes much less than normal DNA. Using mitochondrial DNA allows science to form migration patterns, occupancy over time in an area, and changes in a genome, resulting in possible separation of species. This field of science looks back in history for millions of years and reveals insights invisible to the fossil record. Estimates have the beginning of the Denisovan genome at somewhere between 1,300,000 and 700,000 years ago, and a possible continued existence as late as 50,000 years ago. It isn't a stretch to say that this was a million-year march across the world. Denisovan remains were determined to be the oldest evidence of hominin occupation of the Tibetan plateau and showed human adaptation to high altitude occurred much earlier than previously thought. Denisovan DNA was even found in large proportions in Icelandic populations. It is thought that the Denisovan diaspora reached the edge of Asia, Oceania, and Australia. Portions or even all of the populations in these places show significant traces of Denisovan DNA. A hypothesis is that an original wave of Denisovans spread across the world and then was followed by, or perhaps split, to become Neanderthals. Differing rates of Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA exist in current populations, but eventually both came to share the space with modern humans, fighting, living, and interbreeding for tens of thousands of years. Many isolated spots retain higher concentrations of Denisovan DNA, such as the Aboriginal population of Australia or islands throughout Oceania. There is a theory in taxonomy where animals are classified as whatever their ancestor was. Although this theory can, with a certain degree of imagination, turn birds into dinosaurs, it also turns you and me into tiny little arboreal rodent things. More recently, topically, and realistically, we do carry Denisovan DNA, as well as Neanderthal DNA and Neanderthal Denisovan DNA. All of these groups, and probably others, have incorporated into what we think of as the modern human genome. Science has revealed a group of hominins that existed over much of the world, persevered for possibly hundreds of thousands of years, were contemporaries of Neanderthals and the very first Homo sapiens, and became a part of who we all are. Think Denisovans are a fascinating addition to the humanity family reunion? Check out the first members of the family with our Homo erectus video or any other that interests you. Please subscribe and like A Day in History for more historical goodness. And hopefully, no one runs into Dragon Man in a dark alley.